Here he comes now, the big hand.
Hey there, Plastiques! Welcome to yet another video. It's Joe here, and today I will be showing you guys how I made the Snow Miser from The Year Without a Christmas. To end off the year, me and Rachel really wanted to do one final doll custom based on one of the classics from Rankin Bass. Now this is actually very close to my heart because I grew up with these holiday specials. We both work in stop motion. It's what got me into the arts. I'm really excited to be able to make my own version of the Snow Miser, or shall I say Mrs. Snow Miser. I actually made a sketch. I know, very unusual for me. I actually don't draw very often. I just wanted to draw a very fast and simple design of what I wanted to go for. I really wanted to go with the over-exaggerated features of the Snow Miser with the massive head, a large nose, feminize it a bit. This is a gender bend. Stuck with the basic colors of blue, the shape that he has the jagged edge of the sweater, so I really wanted to translate that into a dress. Since the film was actually released in 1967, I looked through fashion history to be inspired by the dress. I found some A-line dresses that were very simple, very cute. They just had two darts in the center and a flare on the bottom. I went with this as a basis, and I wanted to add more sparkle, make it be very graphic. I didn't want it to be like super detailed and realistic looking like I usually make my clothes. I just wanted it to be simple. So now that I've shown you the sketch, let's get started with this doll. Here's my victim. It's Abby. And I'm not sure which Abby this is. I actually got her for really cheap from a doll Instagrammer. I think she was about $3. And I'm going to be using a Madonna head from Pearl's customizable doll. Now these dolls have a very flat face, which would make a perfect base for my Mrs. Snow Miser. And now I'm going to be doing quite a bit of body modifications, which I've never done before. In the film, the Snow Miser is quite tall, taller than everyone, and has a very slim build compared to the Heat Miser. So I wanted this to translate in doll form. So I needed this doll to be quite a bit taller. I marked out where I'm going to cut all the limbs and the torso, and I just started going at it with a hacksaw. Brought out my Dremel and cut the rest of the limbs. And here are all the limbs cut. So then I just measure out how much taller I want to make, and I want it to be quite proportional. I make sure that it's the same amount on all the limbs, and I came out with a 1/4 inch. So I drill holes into the small limbs where I'm going to put wire. And then I use a very strong steel wire that I glued, and you'll see that later. I didn't do it on camera. And here I am just prepping the Madonna head. The hair was actually very terrible quality, I'm not going to lie, and it was actually quite hard to get out. So I take epoxy, equal parts of each, and it's very important to wear your gloves, and I just mix both parts evenly. You want to do this for at least 2 minutes so you get a really strong set, and then I just start going in where I made all the spaces. You can see I roll some snakes of clay and just wrap it around limbs. And then for the head, I need the ears to be pointier to look more elf-like, so I add epoxy onto those as well. And you're gonna see part of this was kind of useless because I ended up taking it out and redoing it. Back to the head. I go back and forth between drying times, so no time is wasted. It's very important to smooth out the epoxy as much as you can while it's still semi-wet because it reduces the amount of sanding. So about right here is when I'm smoothing it, and then I realize I should do this in 2 passes. So I take off a bit off and then go in with a thinner layer where I'm going to add on top of later on. You'll see right here that I'm poking holes. I'm sorry if this activates that phobia. I know it does for me. It freaks me out. I don't like holes. Doing this will allow the second layer to adhere even more to the first layer. So I'd say this is actually a very important step. And then back to the head. I'm cleaning up the ears a bit more. Really have to smooth it on so it blends in with the head. And then I add it to the chin because I need the chin to be slightly more exaggerated. And I add to the nose. Now the nose is actually quite thin and triangular, which was exactly what I wanted to go for, but I just needed it to be just a little bit longer, so I added some epoxy. This was actually the hardest part to smooth out because it's such a protrusion from the face, so I really had to go in there with the sculpting tool and then later on just sand it as much as I could to get that transition from epoxy to vinyl. And while it's still wet, I'm just playing around with the shapes. I want it to be slightly more pointy. And now it's time for the second pass of epoxy. So this is a much thinner layer, so it's not so much a strength layer, so I can focus more on smoothing it out instead of dealing with it. The first time I just put blobs of clay and tried to smooth it out, which wasn't ideal because every time I tried to smooth it out, it would smush it and it just was very hard. Because I did a strength layer first where I didn't have to worry about smoothing, it made the smoothing a lot easier. And for the second pass of the face, I decided to add some cheekbones because the Snow Miser has quite enormous cheekbones, so I just wanted to exaggerate that a bit. And it's actually starting to look a little bit like a Hexagon creation, I'm not gonna lie. Now once the epoxy was dry, I sanded for quite a long time, and then it's time to prep the head and body to be completely repainted. So for the head, I use Mr. Super Clear as usual. And for the body, I actually like to use this Bulldog Spray. It's an automotive spray that makes paint stick to anything. It virtually doesn't come off. Like, you have to try really hard for the paint to come off, but it's also very, very toxic, a lot more than Mr. Super Clear. Make sure to wear a respirator. So I tried to blush the body using a pan pastel in white, but then I realized that it was very, very translucent and it would take far too many layers. So I just stuck to trusty old acrylic. And this is actually my favorite technique for repainting heads and bodies, which is to water down the paint quite a bit, brush it onto the surface quite lightly, and then with a makeup sponge, just dab, 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 you'll have a very, very smooth surface. And here I am on the body. Now the Bulldog actually doesn't give tooth, so it was actually quite hard to paint it with acrylics, so it ended up being more layers, and I actually ended up using Mr. Super Clear after a while. Now it's time for everyone's favorite part, the repaint. Now you can tell it's not pure white. After the first few layers of white, I realized I just wanted to make just a little bit of blue in there, just to give it a nice bluish tone. And the sketching phase is what takes the longest for me. This Ladonna head has a very, very flat face and no features that are very distinct around the eye. So it's great for people who love to draw and can freehand quite easily, but I'm not one of those people. So it took me quite a few tries in order to get the eye shapes that I wanted. For the makeup, I actually went for a kind of cartoonish look, a very graphic look. I imagined the Snow Miser would definitely be a drag queen, as Rachel said in our last video. So I started with light gray instead of browns because the browns would have a warm tone underneath. So I sketched everything out with a gray pencil because I wanted it to be cool toned. I just start with the colors after I have the basic shape that I want. Now, I wasn't really referencing anything when I was doing this face up. Usually I like to have a lot of reference pictures around me when I'm doing a face up, but I wanted to go about this blind and just see where my imagination took me, and this is where it brought me. I just really wanted to incorporate the character of the Snow Miser. You know, he's quite severe but also very camp. So yeah, I thought because the Snow Miser is so camp, a drag queen-esque makeup job would suit this Miss Snow Miser. Now, did you guys know that the stop motion for the Rankin Bass films was actually made in Japan? They actually developed the process that we know today for like animating puppets. I believe it was called Animagic. Rankin and Bass went to Japan with their designs, and basically they made the puppets, they animated it. All the Rankin Bass Christmas specials that we all know and love, and non-Christmas specials, they were actually all made in Japan. This is my least favorite part, the eyebrows. Always hard to get them symmetrical, but I feel like I did a better job this time than in my last doll custom. And I really wanted to go for a ombre brow. So tell me guys, which Rankin Bass stop motion is your favorite? I actually grew up with Little Drummer Boy because I grew up in a very Christian household. That would always be on every year during Christmas, and it's actually one of my favorites still to this day. It's very sweet. The animation's rough, but I love it. I just felt like I could relate to the Little Drummer Boy quite a bit because, you know, I hate people a lot too sometimes. I have to admit that it was my first time watching The Year Without a Santa Claus. I have no idea why I'd never seen it. When me and Rachel first proposed the idea of Rankin Bass, I actually imagined doing the Snow Miser and Heat Miser, but I didn't really understand where they came from. I actually mixed up the Snow Miser with the Winter Warlock from Santa Claus is Coming to Town. So for the longest time, I thought they were the same character, but they're actually not at all, but they're kind of similar. I don't know. The Rankin Bass cinematic universe is actually quite confusing. So actually during my research, I saw this video by Quentin Reviews where he talked about the Rankin Bass cinematic universe, and I just had no idea that there were so many films based on these characters that we know and love, and some of them are quite out there. But I really want to check them out. Like, I'd never seen Jack Frost, but I've seen the puppets and stuff, and it looks good. And I've heard that it's probably one of the best ones, so I might watch it for Christmas. In Quentin Reviews, you guys should watch his video. He actually talked about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and how they made the mistake in the title card by putting the wrong date. So instead of the film being released in 1964, like we all know it was, technically the copyright is for 1004 or 1604 or something like that. The copyright is expired, and that's why you always see Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in a lot of commercials during Christmas. So here I am adding lots of highlight. I love highlight, and she definitely needs to have that frost look. And this was about the third layer. Watercolor pencils actually came out very opaque since I colored the face with a very light skin tone, so it was very easy to build up colors. Now, if you're working on a doll and you've repainted the face or body and you want to do blushing or a face up on top of that, you have to be very, very gentle, because if you push your pencils too hard, you will break through the acrylic. But that also depends on what kind of acrylic you use and how you paint it. I find with the technique that I showed you guys, it actually creates a harder acrylic, so it's much harder to scratch through. Now we're going in with white acrylic on the eyes, and this just makes everything pop and stand out a lot more. And of course, more and more layers of highlight. Lots and lots of highlight. And then I went over the lips with some acrylic. I actually used some really cheap acrylic because I didn't realize that I didn't have a navy blue color in better acrylic, and it's very, very hard to mix. So I just used from like the dollar store, and it took quite a few layers, and it turned out more chunkier than if I were to use like Folk Art or one of the other acrylic brands. So it always pays to get the better quality. So here I am just hiding that paint job by adding the watercolor metallic paint on top of it. And that stuff is actually really awesome. I would highly recommend it. I got it from Blick. It was kind of expensive, but the highlight color is just so vibrant and it pops. Now I'm just doing all the finishing details, adding eyelashes. Okay, now it's time for the costume. So this is how I like to make patterns for dolls, so we have a perfect fit every time. So you take a piece of tissue or napkin and you take masking tape, cut it into very thin strips. You just layer it on top of the body until you get a bodice shape. And then you just draw the seam lines where you want. You always want to draw the center fronts and center backs. Cut them out and you have your pattern. And then I just trace that pattern onto some tracing paper, and then I add the flare for the skirt and the jagged edges. And you can see it is quite a massive dart for the front. Add the seam allowance. So I'm using this stretch satin, which was quite stretchy, so I actually had to modify the pattern. It's actually quite some math, but didn't really matter in the end. So let's get stitching. I did make a tulle layer for the dress, and this is just so I have a cleaner finish on the top and the bottom without having to like hem it. Using tulle, since it's so thin, it doesn't bulk out the clothing more, and it's actually what they use in like Barbie clothes. If you like look at older Barbie clothes, not new Barbie clothes, but older Barbie clothes that were lined and were like strapless dresses and stuff, they actually had a layer of tulle or tricot in the middle, and it was very, very thin, but it allowed for a nice clean finish so you don't have like stitching on the outside, because sometimes the design doesn't call for top stitching all around. Then I just sandwich the tulle and the satin layer and sew on the bottom and on the top. Now it's time to add our glitter and sparkle. For the hem, I wanted to use this white glitter that I found. I just used some fabric tack, but honestly I wouldn't recommend this glue because most of it did fall off almost immediately, and I ended up having to go over it again. Actually, the second time around I went over it with Modge Podge, and then I actually painted Modge Podge on top of the glitter, and that just seals in the glitter so it will not come off. And then it's the same with the rhinestones. I just place glue dots where I want and then place the rhinestones individually. You guys don't need a fancy tool to place rhinestones. All you need is a toothpick and a tiny bit of wax. You just put wax on a tip and the wax will pick up the rhinestone. It's perfect, it's cheap. You don't need a fancy tool. Same thing with the rhinestones. They actually, most of them ended up falling off, and I ended up having to re-glue them with Modge Podge. I'm not sure if there's a stronger glue. I tried to use E6000, but it just was not sticking to the satin. Satin is very, very hard to stick things to. And now for the scarf. I actually found this sock that was perfect. It was stripes, exactly how it's supposed to be. So I just cut it up and glued it together to create our scarf. Now for the shoes. So I really wanted to challenge myself and make my own shoes this time. Go ahead and trace out the Monster High foot at the point like I want. And then I get Warbler, which I'd never used before. I've used like thermoplastics before, but never Warbler. I wanted to give it a shot. So I just trace it onto Warbler, and it's really easy to use actually. You just heat it up with a hair dryer, and then I just shape it to the bottom of the foot and the tip with that nice little curl. And then I create a pattern to cut the fabric out of using the same masking tape method. And you want to seam down the middle because that allows it to curve along the curve of the tip. And then once I have my fabric cut out and sewed along this middle, I just glue it onto the Warbler. Just use hot glue. Afterwards, I just doused it in super glue along the bottom, and then I glued another piece of Warbler cut in the same shape on top of it. And you'll see that later. I didn't film that. And for the heel, I actually wanted to incorporate the icicle that the Snow Miser has on his nose. So I wanted to make these icicles. So I actually took some tape, rolled it into a cone, and used my UV resin. And you had an icicle shape. It was very easy. And then I just shape it to the bottom of the heel and then glue it on with the UV resin. I add like drops of UV resin to the icicle so it looks more like icicles, because icicles aren't just straight cone shapes. They have some, ridges and stuff. I paint the trim with Modge Podge and add the same glitter. And this is the trim along the shoe and along the top of the dress. And then I just add glitter along the edge of the shoes as well. And that's just to hide all the imperfections. And as you can see there's a second piece of Warbler that I glued on the bottom. I wanted to give her opera-length gloves because the Snow Miser has short gloves, but we gotta get more extra, so she's getting opera-length gloves. And I'm just showing you guys how I tie a knot with a needle and thread. You just wrap it around and then just pull it through. Super easy. And then I just do a back stitch sewn very close to the arm so we get as tight a fit as possible. And I actually cut the fabric on a bias so it doesn't fray on the ends, and then I just went over it with fray check as well. For the hands, I just painted them with acrylic, using that same cheap acrylic. Actually ended up taking like 5 layers of paint. Even though it's gloves, she's gotta have nails. So I just added some glitter nails to the tips and then I varnished them. And now for the best accessory, his iconic straw hat. I actually decided to use buckram, and if you don't know what buckram is, it's this like kind of linen-y cotton material that's like stiffened, and it's usually used for hats. So I actually ended up using 2 layers of that glued together with Modge Podge, and I just drew out the shapes that I wanted. They were very simple shapes, and then I just glued them together. So actually really easy, and you can actually find this stuff in your local fabric store. It's very easy to find. It's not very expensive. I just happen to have this in my stock from when I used to make costumes. And then I'm gluing the crown to the rim of the hat. I'm just using my trusty Tacky glue. And to hide the seam lines, I just glue another layer of the hat rim with more Modge Podge. And then once it's dry, I go in with a base color that's as close to a straw hat that I could get, and I just paint the whole thing with this nice base color. I do it pretty roughly because I want it to look natural and not like just one blob of color. Once the base is fully dry, then you go in with dry brushing. So I went in first with a layer of yellow ochre, which is a staple in all art, and it just creates some shadows, some depth, so it doesn't look like a fake hat and it looks more realistic. And then I go in with I think it was a dark sienna or raw umber, create more shadows, and then I go in with a very, very light cream color on the highlights. And there you go, we have a hat. Time for the hair, the last thing, guys. It's the same thing that we've all seen. I used this yarn that had some iridescence to it, and I just made my wefts using glue, and it's like you've seen in every other video, I'm sure. I just glue it directly onto the head. And I actually didn't get this on camera, but when I attached the head to the body, I actually ended up cracking quite a bit of the face paint on the chin and around the chest area. You could kind of see behind one of the ears where it kind of cracked. Learn from my mistakes. If you're gonna be rebodying a doll, make sure to put the head before you do the face up. Don't be stupid like me. I just wanted to make a side part, so I just glued it in the opposite direction. You have to wait for the glue to dry. That's very important. Wait for it to dry. And this glue actually dries very fast. It was Aleene's Tacky glue, but it was like fast grab glue, so it dries pretty quickly and it grabs on pretty quickly. And there's the other side, so I push the part to the other side, and then I do the other side of the part. And then I just did some finishing touches off camera, and we have our Miss Snow Miser. So that was my video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed. I really enjoyed starting this channel with you guys. I'm so happy that I have 300 plastics and growing. This channel is starting to grow, and I'm very, very happy. I wish you all a happy holidays. Stay safe, and I will see you guys next year with more dolls, tea, and customs.
I'm Mrs. White Christmas, I'm Mrs. Snow. I'm Mrs. Icicle, I'm Mrs. 10 Below. Friends call me Snow Miser, whatever I touch turns to snow in my clutch. I'm too much. She's Mrs. White Christmas, she's Mrs. Snow. That's right, she's Mrs. Icicle, she's Mrs. 10 Below. Friends call me Snow Miser, whatever I touch turns to snow in my clutch. She's too much. I never want to know a day that's over 40 degrees. I'd rather have it 30, 20, 10, 5 and let it freeze. She's Mrs. White Christmas, she's Mrs. Snow. That's right, she's Mrs. Icicle, she's Mrs. 10 Below. Friends call me Snow Miser, whatever I touch turns to snow in my clutch. Too much. I'm too much.